Have you ever wondered what would have happened if Luffy never became a pirate? What if he was raised by Dragon and trained from the very start as a revolutionary? How would the story of One Piece change? Monkey D. Dragon carried his newborn son to a quiet village, but not long after he took him to be raised with the Revolutionary Army. From the start, Luffy's life was tied to war, secrecy, and the dream of overturning the world government. As Monkey D. Dragon walked inside one of the revolutionary camps with a baby in hand, the soldiers' training stopped and they gawked in disbelief. The soldiers assumed this was just a transitional phase, a temporary situation, just until he could find someplace safe to hide the child. But in this timeline, he never did. Maybe he thought it was safer for him to be by his side, or maybe he figured the best defense was making sure he could protect himself. Luffy's crib was a supply crate. His lullabies were the sound of whispered plans and the clashing of steel during late-night training drills. Where other children learned to walk in grassy fields, Luffy's first steps were on uneven ground, in camps that had to pack up and move at a moment's notice. By the age of 2, Luffy was sneaking into food stores. Soldiers would return from missions exhausted, only to find the rations half gone and crumbs trailing to a sleeping toddler. He fell asleep in the strangest places, in barrels of gunpowder, on top of training dummies, even once clinging upside down to a tree branch. Dragon never scolded his son in front of others. He simply allowed Luffy to be himself. When Luffy was hungry, he ate. When he fell asleep mid-lesson, Dragon let him rest. In the timeline we're much more familiar with, Luffy originally makes a fateful encounter with Shanks and ends up inheriting both a dream and his straw hat. This encounter shapes the whole story and Luffy's journey as we know it. But in this timeline, this fateful encounter never comes to pass. Luffy never inherits the straw hat, and he never goes through that fateful encounter where he decides to pursue his dream of becoming the Pirate King. No Gum Gum fruit was accidentally eaten. His destiny as Pirate King never came into existence. In this timeline, Luffy shapes a different dream, not much dissimilar from his original dream. His dreams were shaped by what he saw around him every day. His journey with the Revolutionary Army caused him to witness villages liberated from the cruel leadership of Marines, celestial dragons, and members of the world government. He heard the stories and dreams of the members of the revolution on how they wanted to create a truly free world. Unlike others, he didn't absorb the ideology through lectures. He absorbed it the same way he absorbed everything, by living it. It was the absence of the single straw hat that would change the entire trajectory of the One Piece timeline as we know it. If Dragon's goal was to raise a successor who understood freedom, he couldn't have asked for a better blank slate. Luffy didn't know about kings, nobles, or politics. He only knew right and wrong. If someone was suffering, he wanted to help. If someone was laughing, he wanted to join. If someone tried to tell him no, he charged forward anyway. The soldiers slowly adjusted to his presence. These people slowly learned to accept Luffy as part of their family. Whenever they would find him stealing food supplies, they complained. Later, they would laugh. The same men who once groaned about babysitting were now letting him climb on their shoulders or spar against their training dummies. They called him reckless, foolish, even dangerous, but they also called him their own. They called him the child of revolution. Dragon never once softened the realities of the missions that the revolutionary members went on. He would let his son see the worst of the world. Luffy saw villages burned by the world government. On other days, he would hear whispers reaching the camps about another revolutionary base destroyed by Cypherpole. While most children were sheltered from such things, Luffy grew up with them. Yet, unlike many others, the darkness never weighed him down. When people around him mourned and lost their light due to the loss of comrades, Luffy would hold their hand and smile. He always laughed and never lost his glow. The Revolutionary Army was built on strategy, discipline, and secrecy. Then there was Luffy. He was very loud, impulsive, and extremely unpredictable. During the years with the army, Luffy was trained by Dragon. The purpose of revolutionary training camps was to break down individuals before building them back up. Late into the night, soldiers studied tactics, ran obstacle courses, and sparred until their bones hurt. Luffy was expected to do the same. Even as a younger child, he would attempt to use the obstacle course. He would fall multiple times and injure himself. More often than not, people would find him unconscious under a different obstacle. They would patch him up and scold him, as he wasn't old enough to train yet. They would tell him to stay clear of the training area, but Luffy would sneak in every time. Eventually, he started excelling at the obstacle course due to his athleticism. Although he was good at this, there were parts of the training regimen he had difficulty catching up with. Strategy. He was a teacher's worst nightmare. He could barely go for 5 minutes before dozing off. Because of this, Luffy wasn't a stranger to discipline. As far as combat stances are concerned, Luffy struggled to remember them. However, he was nothing if not persistent. After seeing a move once, he could try to replicate it again and again, but he was unable to recall forms or stances. During sparring sessions, he would try to use the stances. However, rather than performing what he learned, he would instinctively counterattack. His teachers abandoned rigid schedules. They started letting him fight the way he wanted, and gradually his own fighting style developed. The style he developed was as unpredictable as the boy himself. Luffy fought like a child playing a game. He laughed as he dodged attacks, threw punches with wild swings, and used anything around him as a weapon. Rocks, sticks, even enemy soldiers. He once fought using a cannonball as if it were a club, barely able to lift it, but somehow knocking down a trained Marine. Another time, he dodged between trees in a forest, confusing his sparring partner so badly that the man surrendered surrendered out of frustration. It was ridiculous. It was sloppy, and it worked. Without the gum-gum fruit, Luffy never had rubber powers to rely on. He trained his body. He saw his comrades around him come back injured more than once. Luffy desperately wanted to go out there. He wanted to explore the world, rather than contributing to the cause itself. Luffy desired power to protect what he wanted to protect. It was as simple as that. In order to build up his stamina, Luffy trained his body to its limits. He ran until his legs burned. He chased wild animals through endless forests until he could barely breathe. He climbed cliffs that cut into the sky. He did it all again and again, and only stopped when his muscles could no longer move from exhaustion. Luffy built his strength by lifting barrels heavier than himself. He wrestled soldiers twice his size. He plunged into rivers, dragging large rocks from the riverbed. With persistence, he had built a body that refused to collapse, a mind that refused to surrender, and a spirit that kept burning. Luffy also trained with Sabo. Sabo was rescued by his father Dragon on one of his missions. He had been gravely injured and left for dead after being attacked by the Celestial Dragons. The two had immediately bonded. Sabo and Luffy started training together after Sabo's recovery. They would sprint on rugged grounds and scale tall boulders. After that, they would engage with one another in mock combat. Luffy's chaotic fighting style would always push Sabo to improvise. On the other hand, Sabo's natural agility and precision helped Luffy refine his reflexes. Over time, the two grew stronger together. Dragon gave assistance when necessary as he watched their practice from a safe distance. Through this training, Sabo regained confidence. He had refined his combat skills. The bond Sabo and Luffy constructed was unlike any other, and it would change the course of their lives in the Revolutionary Army. Luffy's time in the Revolutionary Army began to transform from aimless bouts of chaos to a proper training regimen. The Revolutionary members took note of Luffy's astonishing progress. The boy who had ruined every mission now outpaced veterans. He shrugged off pain, exhaustion, and failure. By his teenage years, Luffy was no longer just a boy tagging along. He was a revolutionary in his own right. He took part in missions to free small villages, attacked marine outposts, and drove away bounty hunters who worked for the world government. The funny part? He still approached each mission like an adventure. While other soldiers studied maps, Luffy asked where the food was. While others made escape plans, Luffy figured everything would work out if he just punched hard enough. And frustratingly, it often did. As Luffy grew stronger, Dragon started sending him on missions beyond the training camps. The boy who once laughed in the barracks and tripped over barrels now moved across East Blue as part of the Revolutionary Army, leaving chaos, laughter, and unexpected victories in his wake. Missions became real fights. He freed villages, he raided corrupt marines, he battled bounty hunters. He treated it all as an adventure. In Kokoyashi Village, Luffy experienced his first major confrontation. The village suffered under the harsh control of a notorious fishman. Luffy didn't see a plan to execute. Instead, he saw injustice. He charged into the village, kicking over Arlong's patrol posts and toppling supply crates, laughing as soldiers rushed to stop him. Among the villagers was a girl with a sharp gaze, holding maps and working on an escape plan. This was Nami. In this timeline, Luffy didn't recruit her. He didn't offer her a crew title or make promises. Still, his reckless bravery inspired her. Later, when the revolutionaries returned to set up a network against the world government, Nami joined not as Luffy's lieutenant, but as a quietly determined ally. The boy without any devil fruit powers had nudged her toward a hopeful path. On their way to another mission, Luffy's team approached the Baratie restaurant. Here, Luffy met Sanji, who was working as a chef in the restaurant. Unlike what happened in the original timeline, where Luffy would invite Sanji to be the chef and his crew, there was no such invitation. It wasn't long before Luffy and his team had to depart for their mission. The mission was a simple marine supply raid. He was to intercept a corrupt marine official dealing in illicit weapons trade on a rocky peninsula. The mission was to be carried out covertly. Luffy's team was hiding behind some barrels, observing the docked marine ships from afar with binoculars. They were observing the marine guards talking to someone. The team members slowly looked to the right before taking trouble and looking back at the person the marine official was talking to. It was Luffy! He looked around him, called out to Luffy, and realized that he had gone ahead and blown their cover. A fight ensued. Luffy moved with wild energy, improvising his way over broken docks, crates, and collapsed warehouses, using every piece of debris to stay ahead of his enemies. His body was already battered from the fights. Unknown to him, a bounty hunter had been following his trail. This was our very own well-known Zoro. He emerged from a hidden cove, carefully observing the rugged terrain. His swords were drawn, and his focus was sharp. He moved silently across jagged rocks and overturned barrels, studying every jump and chaotic motion Luffy made. Luffy ran across the rocky peninsula. He jumped over smashed crates and rolled under fallen beams. He used rough rocks to stay ahead of marine patrols. He was all bloodied and bruised, but he kept his energy level up. Zoro crept forward, swords at the ready, walking lightly across the rough surface. He watched Luffy carefully, anticipating his chaotic moves. Without saying a word, he moved to intercept. Luffy charged, swinging wildly and hitting a plank that splintered under him. He rolled forward and cut his side on a sharp piece of debris. He barely managed to keep his balance. Zoro responded with a precise slash. Luffy was forced to evade the blow. The fight moved along the narrow peninsula. Zoro blocked and parried, moving like a shadow, testing his every reaction. Due to Zoro's relentless strikes, Luffy was left completely on the defensive. He was forced to continuously evade. As he was evading, his foot slipped and he fell, scraping himself against the jagged stones. He quickly got up and evaded Zoro's neck strike, barely avoiding the cliff's edge. Finally, Luffy collapsed on a flat rock, exhausted and bleeding. Zoro lowered his swords. Zoro respected Luffy's persistence and spirit. He respected his craft and wanted to battle Luffy when he was at his 100% strength in order to become stronger. He let him go this time, but mentioned that the next time they met, they would duel. This day, a rivalry was born as the battle met with a stalemate. Luffy retained his character and personality through his missions. His missions never went along with the plan. He used unconventional methods to achieve his goals. He would run into a marine patrol, eat all the rations, and quickly escape after being discovered. Although he was a revolutionary, the way he carried himself wasn't that much different from that of a pirate. Rebels learned to expect the unexpected. After East Blue, Luffy's missions took him further from familiar waters and into territories where the world government's grip was tighter and more dangerous. His reputation as Dragon's son was already spreading. In a desert kingdom far from East Blue, Luffy's unit was investigating reports of slavery and illegal research. The sun beat down on the sand and stone, and the camp bustled with revolutionaries. Luffy noticed a young woman moving silently among the workers. Her eyes were scanning scrolls with careful attention. Robin had been surviving on her own, constantly aware of the world government's pursuit. They were after her due to her ability to read poneglyphs. In this timeline, she had already found sanctuary with the revolutionaries under Dragon's protection, accessing forbidden knowledge without fear of capture. He approached her and learned bits of history from her. Robin observed his carefree strength and unshakable morale. They never became captain and crew in this timeline, but had become comrades as revolutionaries. The difference between Luffy and Dragon's leadership became clearer with every mission. Dragon planned, strategized, and executed with cold precision, while Luffy acted on instinct and emotion. Sometimes this caused minor setbacks, supplies destroyed, plans interrupted, civilians accidentally startled, but more often it led to unexpected victories. News of a wild, fearless fighter linked to the revolutionary army reached the ears of Yonko, bounty hunters, and marine admirals alike. Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, and Shanks had also heard rumors regarding Luffy. Big Mom had heard of Luffy's exploits and how her operations were being disrupted by the revolutionaries. Luffy had already liberated a couple of islands under Big Mom's influence. This affected her food distribution and slave operations. Kaido was obsessed with strength and domination. He dismissed the early reports of disruptions caused by Luffy at first. However, his subordinates' repeated failures to repress minor uprisings, as well as rumors of the youngster who moved like a storm, piqued his interest. Kaido's men attempted to stop him. However, they were met with a barrage of fists. Shanks remained largely unaware of the boy in these early years. He was focused on maintaining peace and his own balance in the new world. Luffy had never met him. There was no straw hat, no incidental fruit, and no pirate dream. Instead, Shanks only heard vague whispers about a laughing youngster who appeared untouchable. Shanks filed the information mentally, unsure whether this child was a future ally or a threat. The Big Four made cautious adjustments. Whitebeard fortified areas that were susceptible to rebellion. Big Mom stepped up surveillance on islands that were thought to be secure. Kaido contemplated sending elite troops to look into it. Dragon's influence was growing in ways that were hard to measure, and each Yonko recognized that his son was unpredictable. Unlike other revolutionary fighters, Luffy was unpredictable due to his unique blend of unadulterated joy, inventiveness, and raw strength. Luffy's story made its way across the admirals' desks and cipher pole channels. The Marines were annoyed with numerous operational setbacks owing to Luffy and the revolutionaries' interference. The people were slowly looking toward the revolutionaries for hope rather than the Marines. Villages liberated by the army were rarely taxed or governed once more. Luffy's personal development persisted in the interim. Without the support of a Straw Hat crew, he had to develop his abilities even more. Where in the original timeline, our pirate captain wasn't worried about diversifying his skill set due to his crew members, as a revolutionary, there were a lot of missions that had to be carried out solo. Luffy could not always rely on a team to have his back. Some comrades were assigned to battle, some betrayed the revolution. People came and went. This forced Luffy to learn different tactics. Although he had his strength, he needed to build on his weaknesses as well. As Luffy was not a devil fruit eater in this timeline, there was no restriction on getting him to learn to swim. Luffy developed his skills to the extent where he could perform field missions better. When missions called for infiltration, he used a combination of stealth and frenzied distractions. He would most often opt to be the distraction, as he could hold out in direct combat. He trained his haki under Dragon to be able to combat people with his fists. He had the charm and energy to be the loudest and helped agitate enemies with his laughter and sheer boldness. Although his style lacked elegance, it was unstoppable. He had developed his strength, agility, and endurance naturally. He taught soldiers to be prepared for anything. Luffy's instincts were honed by innumerable real-life battles. Luffy was slowly becoming a legend. Stories of the grinning boy who battled like a storm and freed towns with extraordinary skill made their way to far-off islands, quietly changing loyalties and motivating others to oppose the world government. Through action rather than words, Luffy's joy and liberation spread. The world government became uneasy in the shadows. This boy was uncontrollable uncontrollable, unbuyable, and unflappable. Although he was neither a general nor a pirate, his actions caused the seas to become unstable. Agents from Cypher Pole discussed whether to go after him directly, but Dragon's shielding shadow always blocked a clear path. Luffy's increasing power was a result rather than a deliberate threat to the world. He didn't look for authority. He didn't want to be famous, but he was too important for the world to ignore. It was on one such typical day that the news came like a bolt from beyond the seas. Whitebeard's 2nd Division commander, Portgas D. Ace, had been taken by the Marines and was to be publicly executed in Marineford. It meant bloodshed, anarchy, and the inevitable circus of a pirate's execution for most of the world. To Luffy, it meant irresistible personal stakes, and to Dragon and his revolutionary army, opportunity. His childhood memories rushed back, the time he had spent playing with Ace before Dragon had taken him to the revolutionary base. He remembered Ace's laughter, the way he had taught him small tricks to scale trees, and the way he had always been there as a guardian figure, despite being slightly older. Luffy became more resolved, and a strong determination grew inside him. He was able to get through difficulties because he never gave up. Luffy fondly remembered the time he shared with Ace. Although Luffy was brought up with the revolutionaries, he still felt a strong connection to his brother. This connection motivated him to act. At Marineford, the sky was splitting open, smoke was rising from the horizon, and flames erupted in different places. Cannonballs flew through the harbor, making a loud noise. The ocean waves shook when Whitebeard's ships came into view. Large boats moved across the water. Whitebeard's fleet appeared, huge ships moving across the ocean, Moby Dick leading the way. The elderly man stood tall upon the ship's floor, weapon gripped firmly, his large build commanding attention. It stopped even the most fearless soldiers in their tracks. Whitebeard looked at Ace on the execution stand, and his anger burst as he sent a burst of King's Haki. The pressure was immense as those with weaker wills started to faint. The atmosphere was intense. One second, Whitebeard was looking at the scene, and the next, he was on Marineford, launching an attack. The island shook as the landscape shifted. The walls at Marineford broke, and large pieces of rock fell into the sea when Whitebeard used his power to create earthquakes. Fear quickly took hold among the Marines. The admirals reacted quickly. Hot magma erupted from Sakazuki, Kizaru fired light beams across the sky, and Kuzan created ice to hinder Whitebeard. Powerful pirates took their positions. Mihawk raised his sword. Doflamingo's strings directed the soldiers. Hancock observed the chaos, keeping her gaze fixed. As Whitebeard's pirates fought the Marines, a different group of ships appeared from the smoke. New ships, each with its unique flag, entered the harbor quickly. Everyone was shocked when Dragon showed up on the ship's deck, his cape flying, with the leaders of the revolution beside him. Luffy stood next to him, his hands held in tight fists, his eyes shining brightly. The war shifted in an instant. Two legendary forces had joined hands. Luffy launched himself into the fight. His chaotic strikes tore through Marine soldiers as he improvised weapons out of debris and ropes. He desperately called out for Ace as Marines blocked his path. Dragon moved like a storm, with every strike calculated. He neutralized the commanders and created gaps for his son to push forward. The climb to Ace's platform was a brutal gauntlet. Mihawk intercepted them, his black blade carving arcs that threatened to split the ground itself. Luffy barely dodged and stumbled forward. Dragon parried the strike with precision. Doflamingo's threads lashed out, snagging pirates and revolutionaries alike. His threads were torn apart by a quake from Whitebeard himself. Kuma's silent form loomed in the background, strangely hesitant to unleash his full power against Luffy. Meanwhile, Monkey D. Garp, Luffy's grandfather and Dragon's father, stood beside Ace as they both watched the chaos unfold. Amid the chaos, Luffy tried to break through. When he tried to reach for Ace, Mihawk would counter again and hold him in place. As Mihawk was about to slash toward Luffy again, the ground shook. The ground beneath Luffy rose, vaulting him up toward the execution platform. Whitebeard had created an opportunity for Luffy to get to Ace. With bloodied hands, he smashed Ace's chains, ignoring the pain in his bones. Ace collapsed into his arms, his voice hoarse but alive. For the first time in years, the brothers were together again. Garp stood beside the brothers, but made no attempt to stop them. His duty as a Marine did not allow him to help Ace, but he couldn't make himself stop them from escaping. The victory was short-lived. Sakazuki cursed at Garp for his incompetence as he surged forward. The magma erupted in a devastating wave aimed directly at Ace. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then Garp moved. The old man's massive body shielded both Luffy and Ace, magma searing into his chest and side. His roar shook the heavens, not of pain, but of defiance. Ace and Luffy watched in shock as Garp took a hit for them. He shouted at them to move. Whitebeard rushed forward and swung his Basento with earth-shattering force. The quake split the ground and hurled the Marines back. The execution platform collapsed, scattering debris across the battlefield. Ace screamed his father's name, but Whitebeard only pushed him back, his massive hand shoving both of the brothers towards safety. Marco rushed in his phoenix form, covering for Ace and Luffy, and screaming at them to leave before they made the situation worse. Dragon rushed to protect Garp as Sakazuki aimed for a more fatal attack. Luffy and Ace were in shock as they ran toward the ship. They were almost there when Kuma, who had been silently observing, made his move. A beam of attack aimed at Ace's back came rushing forward. Ace was shoved down. He was expecting to feel pain but did not feel anything. The attack did not meet its target. He looked up to see that Whitebeard had taken the attack for him. His body was already failing, blood pouring from his wounds, yet he refused to fall. Each quake he unleashed was a declaration that no Marine, Admiral, or government government could break his will. As Kuma struck again, Whitebeard met him head-on. Their clash split the air. The impact shook the island so violently that even the strongest fighters staggered. Finally, Kuma's fist pierced deep into Whitebeard's side. The old man coughed blood, but still he swung, smashing Kuma into the rubble. With his last strength, Whitebeard created a rift across the battlefield, opening a path wide enough for Ace, Luffy, Dragon, and Garp to escape. He died protecting his family. The man who had called his crew his sons stood unbowed. Whitebeard died on his feet, unbroken, a giant until the end. The battlefield froze. Pirates screamed in rage. Revolutionaries pressed forward with renewed fury, and even Marines wavered at the sight of the strongest man sacrificing everything for his children. Ace collapsed to his knees beside Luffy, fists trembling, tears burning his eyes. Dragon stood grim and silent as he supported Garp's limp body. His other hand gripped Luffy's shoulder, prompting him to move. The Whitebeard pirates, enraged and grieving, had no choice but to retreat. They gathered around Ace and Luffy in order to protect them. The battlefield of Marineford was nothing but fire and ruin. The plaza where Ace had once been shackled now lay cracked and smoking, shattered by quakes and magma alike. Whitebeard's body rested motionless at the center, a giant even in death, his shadow stretching far over the ruined walls. His roar had been the last barrier, his sacrifice the only reason Ace still breathed. The Whitebeard pirates fought with desperation to hold the line. Marco, wings ablaze, darted between collapsing towers, shielding his brothers from Admiral Kizaru's relentless beams. Jozu, still bleeding from his battle, hurled debris to block Sakazuki's advance. Vista's blades clashed with Marine vice admirals who swarmed like hornets, eager to end the era once and for all. Ace stumbled forward. Luffy caught his arm, steadying him. They locked eyes only briefly, both filled with grief and fury. As they retreated, the ground shook again. Around Whitebeard's corpse, a pool of darkness formed. From the pool came Blackbeard. Blackbeard strode forward with his crew behind him, his laughter echoing through the smoke. He covered Whitebeard's corpse and himself with a cloth. In a minute, the earth around them quaked, and from the cloth walked out Blackbeard. He had stolen the powers of the Gura Gura no Mi. Sakazuki, realizing the danger of letting the devil fruit powers be stolen, struck against Blackbeard. Blackbeard countered. The revolutionaries seized the chance. Garp was carried by his son toward a waiting ship. Luffy and Ace fought. Sabo carved a path with his pipe, his face grim but determined, refusing to lose his brothers. But escape was not easy. Kizaru's light lances pierced the air, pinning retreating soldiers. Kuzan froze the harbor, ships locked in ice before they could sail. Sakazuki barreled toward Ace again, magma dripping like blood, shouting of justice and fate. Ace, still shaky, raised his flames in defiance, but his knees buckled. The ground split as Blackbeard slammed his new power into the earth. The ground collapsed. Marine ships were capsized, and the plaza caved in. There was smoke around, and screams could be heard. Blackbeard's laughter could be heard over it all. Marco swooped down, wings shielding Ace and Luffy. The sea, which was once frozen, was cracked open as Dragon's commanders unleashed their powers. They broke the Admiral's hold for a fleeting moment. It became a race. Whitebeard's commanders turned one last time, holding back the tide. Marco and Vista locked blades with the Admirals, their eyes shining with fury. Jozu planted himself like a wall, holding debris against the crushing quake. Marco shouted at Luffy to take Ace and leave the battlefield. Ace screamed his protest, but Sabo and Luffy dragged him toward the ships. Ivankov pushed them forward, tears streaming even as he grinned defiantly. People rallied close. They tried protecting them with their bodies. And then, with a roar that shook the heavens, the Allied forces broke free. Luffy fell onto the deck near Ace. They both looked at the outline of Marineford, shrinking from view as it burned. Though its message had been tainted by blood, the flag of justice continued to wave. Whitebeard's body lay motionless behind them, Blackbeard's darkness already claiming the battlefield. Ace, however, survived. Ace's chains were gone, but his heart was heavy. He sat in solitude observing the ocean waves. The revolutionaries had bled for him, and Whitebeard had died for him. Fire flickered at his fingertips as he clenched his fists. That was a debt he could never pay back. Luffy, exhausted and bandaged, leaned against him. He didn't have to speak. His presence said enough. They were alive, together. And Garp, barely breathing, lay below deck, his life hanging by a thread. Dragon assisted him and made sure to get him first aid. Now that Garp had shielded Luffy and Ace, he had effectively gone against the Marines and could no longer stay with them. The escape was not a victory. It was survival. They did not know it yet, but the world had just witnessed the birth of a storm greater than anything before. Where in the original timeline, different factions came up to rule the new world, this world was slowly becoming divided into two distinct factions. Those with the world government and those against it. The journey after Marineford was a blur. The Allied fleet limped across the Grand Line. At night, they would bury the fallen at sea. They'd send flaming boats into the horizon as prayers for the dead. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes. The cries of battle were still ringing in their ears. Luffy remained by Ace's side. His wounds were wrapped up but not healed. His spirit was flickering between relief and raw sorrow. He had fought harder than ever before, yet the image of Whitebeard's final stand stayed carved into his mind. The giant who had refused to fall until his sons were safe had burned his sacrifice into them both. Ace carried it heavier than anyone. He barely spoke. His gaze always turned to the waves. The fire in him was not gone, but it smoldered differently now, sharpened by guilt and the knowledge that Whitebeard's final roar had been for him. His life was no longer his alone. It belonged to every crewmate who had fought to free him, and to every revolutionary who had bled beside them. The Whitebeard pirates rallied around Marco, but even Marco admitted that the family could not remain the same. He could try to step into Whitebeard's position, but he knew those shoes were too big and the burden too heavy to bear. Right now, their priority was to organize the remaining members and protect them. After Whitebeard's death, they were in a weak position. There was no doubt that their enemies would choose this opportunity to strike. Ace stood before them one evening, the deck creaking under his weight. He did not promise to replace their father. He promised to honor him. It was then that a strange idea began to take root with the Whitebeard pirates, not as lords of territories, but as allies of the Revolutionary Army. The world trembled in the aftermath of Marineford. Whitebeard was gone, his death marking the end of an era. Ace lived. Against fate, against the will of the admirals and the noose of the world government, Port Gastee Ace had been saved and rescued not just by his brother's reckless courage, but by the sacrifice of countless others who bled and died on that battlefield. Luffy and Dragon were not spared from the effect either. Monkey D. Garp, one of the greatest Marines in history, lay broken, kept alive only by desperate measures and the hands of their best healers. His room smelled of herbs and bandages. Luffy looked at Garp in frustration. If only he was strong enough. If only he was fast enough. These thoughts plagued his mind. Dragon came into the room and stood behind Luffy. Both gazed at the limp figure of Garp. He held Luffy's shoulder and squeezed it. Luffy understood. This wasn't the end. This was the norm. In the revolution, people came and people went. That was the cost of freedom. If the cost was this high, then Luffy didn't want freedom in this way. He would carve his own path. He would become strong enough to protect what he wanted to protect, whether it was his friends' lives or his freedom. Luffy was not going to take this casually anymore. He expressed his desire to get stronger to Dragon. Dragon understood where his son was coming from and asked him to travel to Sabaody Archipelago where, as per their intel, Rayleigh was found. He gave Luffy a letter and asked him to deliver it to Rayleigh. It appeared as though this world was different. Some encounters were fated to happen. It is here that Luffy would find Rayleigh and would train his haki under his mentorship. Ace was still raw from loss and survival. After Whitebeard's death, the crew was fractured and had no direction. Amidst this, Ace spoke up and expressed his intentions to join the revolution. He wanted to get stronger, and he believed staying here could help him. Staying here would help him gain strength and intel regarding Blackbeard's movements. Ace was resolved to complete his unfinished business and kill Blackbeard. Listening to this, Marco expressed his intention to gather the scattered Whitebeard pirates. Half the pirates resolved to join Marco, whereas the other half joined Ace. The Revolutionary Army transformed overnight. What had been a scattered network of rebels became a swelling tide fueled by the rage of fallen pirates and oppressed nations. Their banners now carried not just Dragon's mark, but the crest of Whitebeard, united under one cause. The world, watching with bated breath, realized that Marineford had not ended an era, but ignited a greater one. In this timeline, Sabo and Ace reunited. Where Luffy, Sabo, and Ace originally spent their childhood together, Luffy had left with Dragon before Ace had ever encountered Sabo. Thus, the revolution did not falter after Marineford. It grew. Marineford, intended by the world government as a show of power, became their greatest mistake. The world had seen Whitebeard fall, but they also saw his fire pass on. They saw the revolution endure its greatest wound without breaking. And they saw three brothers, forged by fate and war, stand at its core. What began as a battle to execute one man ended with the birth of a movement too vast to contain. Make sure to subscribe and smash the like button for more One Piece videos.